A child enters the ICU clutching a coin and asks to buy a miracle. The doctor attending her cannot hold back his tears. The city was a cold labyrinth of shadows and indifference. For Lucas, barely 13, and his 8-year-old sister Sophia, it was home. The siblings had long since learned to navigate its alleys and underpasses, surviving on scraps and sheer will. Each day was a test of resilience, and every night was a gamble for safety. Lucas held Sophia's hand tightly as they moved through the bustling streets, eyes darting from one potential threat to another. He had a protective instinct that belied his years, born of necessity rather than choice. Sophia, despite the grime on her face and the threadbare coat that barely kept the cold at bay, carried a spark of innocence. She clutched a stuffed rabbit with missing ears, her sole connection to a happier past. "Lucas," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you think we'll find something to eat today?" Lucas forced a smile, though his stomach growled in protest. "Of course we will. I'm your big brother. I'll take care of you." Their daily routine was a delicate balance of scavenging and evading danger. The streets were full of potential harm, strangers with suspicious smiles, hostile shopkeepers, and packs of stray dogs. But Lucas and Sophia had each other, and that bond was stronger than fear. As the sun dipped lower, painting the city in hues of gold and crimson, Lucas spotted a bin outside a small bakery. He gestured for Sophia to stay close as he approached, his heart pounding with hope. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the sharper tang of city grime. "Stay here," he instructed, setting Sophia down on a nearby bench. "I'll be quick." Sophia nodded, her wide eyes following him as he crept toward the bin. She began to hum softly to herself, a tune their mother used to sing, before everything fell apart. As she hummed, her gaze landed on something shiny glinting under the bench. Curiosity sparked, and she reached down to pick it up. It was a coin, dull around the edges but shimmering where the light hit it. Sophia smiled, clutching it tightly. To her, it was more than just a piece of metal, it was a treasure, a token of hope in a world that had given them so little. But hope was fleeting. A low growl interrupted Sophia's thoughts. She froze as a large, mangy dog emerged from the shadows, its teeth bared and its eyes locked on the coin in her hand. Panic surged through her small body as the dog lunged. She screamed. Lucas's head snapped up at the sound. He abandoned the bin and sprinted towards Sophia, his heart hammering. "Sophia," he shouted, throwing himself between his sister and the dog. The animal's teeth sank into his arm, and pain shot through him like fire. But Lucas didn't falter. With a primal yell, he swung his free arm, managing to drive the dog back. The dog hesitated, snarling, before retreating into the shadows. Lucas dropped to his knees, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from his arm, staining the ground. He turned to Sophia, who was trembling but unharmed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Lucas. I found this." She opened her hand, revealing the coin. Lucas stared at it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled her into a tight hug. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're okay." But they weren't. Lucas knew Sophia needed help, real help. Her pale face and the faint wheeze in her breath were signs he could no longer ignore. Ignoring the pain in his arm, he hoisted her onto his back. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly. Sophia's small arms wrapped around his neck. "Will they help us?" Lucas hesitated but forced himself to nod. "They have to." As the city's lights flickered on, Lucas carried his sister through the streets, the coin clinking softly in her hand. Each step was heavy with exhaustion and fear, but also determination. Lucas wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for hope. The hospital stood like a fortress of fluorescent lights and cold architecture against the night's shadows. For Lucas, the journey to reach it had been an uphill battle, with Sophia's weight on his back and his injured arm throbbing in pain. The boy's steps faltered as he pushed through the heavy glass doors, a swirl of exhaustion and desperation coursing through him. Inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air, mingling with the subdued hum of voices and the occasional announcement crackling over the intercom. Patients in varying states of distress crowded the waiting area, creating a chaotic backdrop that made Lucas's heart sink further. He approached the reception desk, his eyes wide and pleading. "Please," he croaked, his voice rough from the cold and the weight of his worry. "My sister, she needs help." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with sharp features, barely looked up from her computer. "Do you have insurance?" she asked flatly, her fingers typing without pause. Lucas froze. The question wasn't unexpected, but it landed like a blow nonetheless. "No," he admitted quietly. But she's really sick. Please, you have to help her." The woman sighed, finally looking up to take in the sight of Lucas, his bloodied sleeve, his trembling frame, and the pale, motionless girl on his back. Something in her expression softened, though her professionalism remained intact. She picked up the phone and muttered into it before gesturing toward a set of chairs. "Wait there. Someone will come soon." Lucas nodded, swallowing back the frustration that threatened to spill over. He gently set Sophia down on one of the chairs, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She looked so small, her breathing shallow and uneven. He clenched his fists, willing himself not to cry. Minutes stretched into an eternity before a nurse appeared, her quick strides and furrowed brow betraying her concern. "Follow me," she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. Lucas scooped Sophia back into his arms and trailed after her down a sterile, brightly lit hallway. The examination room was a flurry of motion as the nurse assessed Sophia's condition. Lucas stood to the side, watching helplessly as the woman's face grew more serious. "She's critical," the nurse muttered under her breath before pressing a button on the wall. A soft alarm sounded, and moments later, a small team of medical staff entered the room. "What's her name?" one of them asked, snapping on a pair of gloves. "Sophia," Lucas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She got sick. And then there was a dog, it bit me, but she's the one who needs help." The staff exchanged glances but didn't press for more details. Sophia was swiftly transferred onto a gurney, monitors and IVs attached to her frail body with practiced efficiency. Lucas followed as far as he could until a nurse gently stopped him at the door. "You need to stay here," she said, her tone soft but firm. "We'll do everything we can." Lucas nodded, though the words did little to calm the storm inside him. He found himself alone in the dim corridor, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him like a physical force. Nearby, the faint sound of footsteps echoed, and Lucas glanced up to see a man in a white coat, Dr. Arthur. Arthur leaned against a wall, reviewing a patient's chart with an air of detachment. His disheveled appearance and weary eyes hinted at a man going through the motions, uninvested and uninspired. Lucas's gaze lingered on him for a moment before the boy's focus returned to the closed door behind which Sophia lay, fighting for her life. The corridor stretched endlessly in Lucas's mind, its pale walls a stark canvas for the chaos and fear swirling inside him. He sat hunched over on a plastic chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the ground. Sophia was behind that door, her small body surrounded by machines and strangers. Each passing second gnawed at his resolve, filling the silence with a chorus of what-ifs. Lucas clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the dirt and dried blood that covered them. The coin Sophia had found earlier sat cold and heavy in his pocket. He pulled it out and turned it over in his hands, the edges worn smooth. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to hope that it held some kind of magic, a charm to fix everything. Footsteps echoed again, and Lucas looked up to see the same man in the white coat, Dr. Arthur, walking toward him. The doctor's gaze swept over Lucas, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Lucas felt the weight of the man's judgment, his tattered clothes, the blood stain on his sleeve, the desperation written all over his face. Arthur stopped in front of Lucas, holding the chart loosely in one hand. "You're her brother?" he asked, his tone flat. Lucas nodded quickly. Yes. Is Sophia okay? The doctor's lips pressed into a thin line. She's stable for now. But we're monitoring her closely. Lucas exhaled sharply, relief flooding him for the briefest moment before the fear crept back in. Thank you, he whispered. Please, please don't let her die. Arthur's expression softened imperceptibly, but his voice remained clinical. We'll do our best. The words felt hollow, but Lucas clung to them anyway. As the doctor turned to leave, Lucas called after him. Wait. Arthur paused, looking over his shoulder. Lucas hesitated, gripping the coin tightly in his palm. This is all I have, he said, holding it out. Please, if you can save her, take it. It's worth everything. Arthur froze, his eyes flickering between Lucas's face and the coin. The gesture, so small yet so profound, struck a chord deep within him. Memories he'd buried for years began to surface, his own son, the life he'd failed to save, the weight of his own mistakes. He cleared his throat, taking a step back. Keep it, Arthur said gruffly. It's not needed. Lucas's hand fell back to his side, and the doctor walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Alone again, Lucas clutched the coin, its metal pressing into his skin. Please, he whispered to no one in particular. I just need a miracle. Dr. Arthur lingered outside the operating room, the chart clutched in his hands like a shield. He had walked away from Lucas, but the boy's words lingered in his mind. They clung to him, heavier than the weight of any scalpel he'd ever held. Please, if you can save her, take it. It's worth everything. The exhaustion that usually dulled Arthur's thoughts began to give way to a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, doubt. He reviewed the girl's test results and his own preliminary notes. There were signs of infection, subtle but present, and it was clear her condition required immediate attention. Yet the protocols were strict, and the hospital's recent audit made every decision feel like a risk to his already fragile career. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. He thought of the boy sitting outside, clutching that coin as if it were a lifeline. He thought of his son, a memory that had long been buried beneath layers of grief and resignation. What would his son have wanted him to do? The answer was obvious, but the courage to act on it felt so far away. Inside the operating room, the staff worked efficiently, stabilizing Sophia's vital signs. But her fever wasn't subsiding, and the machines monitoring her heart showed irregularities. A nurse looked up at Arthur, her expression one of expectation. Dr. Arthur? Should we proceed with the exploratory surgery? She asked, her voice steady but urgent. Arthur's hesitation stretched the moment unbearably long. The wrong decision could mean losing the girl. The right decision could mean saving her but losing his job if the administration deemed his actions unnecessary or costly. It was a gamble, one he wasn't sure he could afford to take. But then he heard Lucas's voice in his mind, clear and unyielding, please, I just need a miracle. Arthur straightened his posture, his voice firm. Prepare for surgery. Notify the pediatric specialist and get the OR ready. We're not waiting. The team sprang into action, and Arthur felt the familiar rhythm of urgency take over. It was as if a long-dormant part of him had come alive, shaking off years of apathy. As they worked to prepare Sophia for surgery, he found himself glancing at the clock, aware of every passing second. Each one felt like both a countdown and an opportunity. Outside, Lucas remained in the corridor, his body curled into the chair as exhaustion began to claim him. The coin rested in his hand, a small token of hope that he refused to let go of. He didn't know what was happening behind those doors, but he whispered to himself, over and over, please, save her. Please. In the operating room, as Arthur scrubbed in and the team moved into position, he took a deep breath. The weight of his decisions had never felt heavier. But for the first time in years, he wasn't running from it. Instead, he stepped forward, ready to fight for a life that wasn't his own. The operating room buzzed with tension as the team prepared for Sophia's surgery. Dr. Arthur stood at the head of the table, his gloved hands steady but his mind racing. The bright surgical lights cast harsh reflections off the metal instruments, and the beeping monitors punctuated the silence. Arthur's voice broke through. "Scalpel," he commanded, his tone steady despite the turmoil inside him. The pediatric specialist, Dr. Patel, entered briskly, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Arthur," she said, glancing at Sophia's frail form, "I wasn't expecting this call. What's the urgency?" Arthur didn't meet her gaze. "Infection. It's progressing fast. I'm not waiting for an official green light." Patel raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Understood. Let's make it count." As the first incision was made, the room seemed to hold its breath. Arthur's focus sharpened, his usual detachment replaced by a fierce determination. Every movement of his hands was precise, guided by years of experience that, for too long, had been dulled by apathy. Heart rates dropping, a nurse reported, her voice cutting through the room. Arthur's jaw tightened. "More fluids. Prepare to stabilize." The moments dragged on, each second critical. Outside the room, Lucas stirred from his restless nap. His heart raced as he stared at the operating room doors, willing them to open with good news. Inside, the battle raged on. Arthur worked methodically, cleaning out the infection that had begun to spread. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, but he didn't pause. His mind drifted, unbidden, to images of his son, a boy who had once stared up at him with the same trust he now saw in Lucas's eyes. "Arthur," Patel's voice snapped him back. "We're losing her." "No," Arthur said sharply. "We're not. Hand me the suction." The room moved in synchrony, every team member focused on Sophia's fragile body. Arthur made the final adjustments, clearing the remaining infection and carefully stitching the incision. The room's tension peaked as everyone watched the monitors, waiting for a sign. The soft, steady beep of a normalized heart rate broke the silence. "She's stabilizing," the nurse confirmed, her voice tinged with relief. Arthur exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline drained from his body. He stepped back, his gaze fixed on Sophia's small face. "We're not out of the woods yet," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Dr. Patel clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it, Arthur. She's got a fighting chance now." Arthur nodded but said nothing. He peeled off his gloves and left the room, his mind a whirlwind of relief and exhaustion. In the corridor, Lucas sat up as Arthur approached. The boy's eyes were wide, searching the doctor's face for answers. Arthur knelt before him, his voice softer than Lucas had heard before. "She made it through the surgery," he said. "But she'll need time and care to recover." Lucas's lip quivered, and tears spilled down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching the coin in his hand. "Thank you so much." Arthur looked at the coin for a long moment. "Keep it," he said quietly. "It's more valuable than you know." For the first time in years, Arthur felt a flicker of something he'd thought lost forever, hope. The hours after the operation passed in a haze for Lucas. He sat slumped in the corridor outside the ICU, his legs pulled to his chest, the coin still clutched in his hand. Nurses occasionally passed by, offering him small smiles of reassurance, but no one spoke to him directly. The dim lighting and muffled beeping from inside Sophia's room made the passage of time feel unreal, as though the world had narrowed to this singular point of waiting. Dr. Arthur, meanwhile, had retreated to the staff lounge, though rest was the furthest thing from his mind. He sat with his head in his hands, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. The memories of his son, of his failure, felt fresh again, as if no time had passed. But there was something different this time, a faint thread of hope woven into the pain. His thoughts were interrupted by Dr. Patel, who entered holding a steaming cup of coffee. "You should get some sleep," she said, setting the cup on the table in front of him. Arthur shook his head. "I can't. Not until I know she's stable." Patel studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You did good work, Arthur. You gave her a real chance. Not every doctor would have risked their career for a patient. It wasn't just about her, Arthur admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was about me. About everything I should have done differently years ago. Patel nodded slowly. Redemption's a powerful motivator. Arthur didn't respond, but the truth of her words lingered as he got up and headed back to the ICU. Inside Sophia's room, the steady rhythm of machines monitoring her vitals provided a comforting soundtrack. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful. Lucas sat beside her, holding her hand gently in his own. He whispered to her occasionally, small promises about the future and reassurances that she would get better. When Arthur entered, Lucas looked up sharply, his eyes red from crying. "Is she going to wake up?" he asked, his voice raw with fear and exhaustion. Arthur knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "She's stable now. Her body just needs time to heal. You did everything you could, Lucas. And so did we." Lucas nodded, his grip on Sophia's hand tightening. "Thank you," he whispered again, his gratitude so intense it seemed to physically fill the room. Arthur glanced at the coin resting on the bedside table. Its surface gleamed faintly in the light. "You know," he said softly, "that coin, it might not buy miracles, but it represents something just as important, belief." Lucas tilted his head, confused. "Belief in what?" "Belief in yourself," Arthur replied. "In the people around you who care. In the fact that sometimes, even when it seems impossible, things can change for the better." Lucas's gaze returned to Sophia, and for the first time since the ordeal began, his expression softened with a hint of hope. Arthur straightened, his resolve firming. "I'm going to check on a few things. Stay here with your sister." As he left the room, Arthur found himself making silent vows. He would not let this moment of redemption slip away. There was still much to do, both for Sophia and for himself. But for the first time in years, he felt capable of facing it head-on. Days turned into a week, and Sophia's recovery became the hospital's quiet miracle. The ICU team marveled at her resilience, but for Lucas, every improvement was nothing short of a gift. He stayed by her side through every hour, the coin never far from his reach. On the 7th day, the machines monitoring Sophia's vitals began to hum with stronger, steadier rhythms. Her once fragile breaths grew deep and even, and color began to return to her cheeks. It was early morning when Sophia finally stirred. Lucas had dozed off in the chair by her bed, his head resting on the edge of the mattress. Sophia's small hand brushed against his, and he jolted awake. "Sophia?" he asked, his voice trembling. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion flickering before recognition lit her face. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice hoarse but unmistakably alive. He leaned forward, tears pooling in his eyes. "You're okay," he said, barely able to contain his emotions. "You're okay." Sophia's gaze wandered to the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where are we?" "We're in a hospital," Lucas explained softly, squeezing her hand. "You got really sick, but the doctors, they helped you. They saved you." Sophia's brow furrowed, her voice growing steadier. "Are you okay?" "The dog?" Lucas grinned through his tears. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the coin. "Look. Your lucky coin worked. It brought us a miracle." Sophia smiled weakly, her fingers brushing against the coin. "I knew it was special." Later that day, Dr. Arthur entered the room for his routine check. His white coat was as rumpled as ever, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a lightness that hadn't been there before. He found Lucas sitting cross-legged on the bed next to Sophia, the two of them deep in conversation. "Good morning," Arthur said, his voice warm. Lucas looked up, his face breaking into a grin. "Dr. Arthur." She woke up. Arthur approached the bed, his trained eye assessing Sophia. Her color was better, her pulse strong. "You're looking much better, Sophia," he said. "Thank you, Dr. Arthur," she murmured. "Lucas says you saved me." Arthur paused, his gaze shifting to Lucas. "Your brother saved you first," he said gently. "Without him, we wouldn't have had the chance to help." Lucas flushed under the praise but didn't speak. Arthur pulled up a chair, his tone softening. "Sophia, you're doing great, but you'll need time to get your strength back. No running around just yet, okay?" Sophia nodded solemnly. Arthur hesitated, then turned to Lucas. "Have you thought about what happens next? Where you'll go once Sophia's ready to leave?" The question hit Lucas like a tidal wave. The hospital had become their sanctuary, a bubble of safety and care. The thought of returning to the streets was like plunging into icy water. "I don't know," Lucas admitted, his voice small. Arthur leaned forward. "I've spoken with the social worker here. They can help find a place for both of you, somewhere safe. You shouldn't have to do this alone anymore." Lucas's first instinct was to refuse, to insist he could handle it. But when he looked at Sophia, her small frame still fragile in the bed, he realized the truth. They needed help. "Okay," Lucas said finally, his voice trembling with both relief and fear. Arthur smiled, the first genuine smile Lucas had seen from him. "Good. We'll make sure you're taken care of." That evening, as the hospital grew quieter, Arthur found himself standing outside Sophia's room, watching Lucas read to her from an old book he'd borrowed from the hospital library. The scene stirred something deep within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Patel approached, carrying a clipboard. "Still here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Arthur nodded. "I wanted to check on them one last time." Patel followed his gaze. "They're remarkable, aren't they? You don't see that kind of bond often." Arthur's expression softened. "No, you don't." Patel studied him for a moment. "You've changed, Arthur. I think they've done as much for you as you have for them." Arthur didn't reply immediately, his eyes never leaving the siblings. "Maybe," he said quietly. As he turned to leave, he felt a small weight in his pocket. His hand brushed against the edge of a coin, an identical one he'd found on his desk earlier that day, left by Lucas with a note that simply said, "For your miracles." Arthur smiled to himself, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Weeks later, Sophia was discharged from the hospital. Her recovery had been slow but steady, and with every passing day, her strength returned. Lucas stood beside her as they left the building, the coin securely tucked in her pocket now, a shared treasure they both believed had brought them through the darkest moments. Waiting at the hospital's front steps was Dr. Arthur, no longer the detached figure they had first met. His white coat was gone, replaced by a simple jacket, and his posture held an ease that hadn't been there before. Beside him stood a kind-looking woman with a clipboard, the social worker who had been arranging a new home for the siblings. "Are you ready?" Arthur asked, his voice warm. Lucas nodded, gripping Sophia's hand tightly. "We are." The social worker smiled. "We've found a place for both of you. It's not far, and the family is excited to meet you. They're kind people who want to help." Lucas glanced at Sophia, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. For the first time in years, the prospect of stability didn't feel like a dream but something tangible and real. As they prepared to leave, Lucas turned back to Arthur. "Will we see you again?" he asked, his voice hesitant but hopeful. Arthur crouched to their level, his gaze steady. "You will. I'll check in to make sure everything's going well. And if you ever need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." Lucas didn't reply, but the fierce hug he gave Arthur said more than words could. When he pulled away, Sophia stepped forward, her small voice breaking the momentary silence. "Thank you for our miracle," she said. Arthur's throat tightened, but he managed a smile. "You too were the miracle. Never forget that." The social worker led the siblings to a waiting car, and as they drove away, Arthur stood on the steps, watching until they were out of sight. For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep within, a purpose that had been buried beneath years of grief and routine. Arthur turned back toward the hospital, his steps lighter, his heart fuller. He didn't know where this newfound sense of hope would take him, but he was ready to embrace it. Lucas and Sophia's courage had reminded him of what he had once believed, that even in the face of impossible odds, miracles were possible, not because of magic, but because of the connections that bound people together. As the doors of the hospital slid shut behind him, Arthur whispered to himself, "It's never too late for a new beginning."